Martin Vickers to move the motion.
Thank you, Mrs Lewis. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair this afternoon. I'm sure you'll witness a stimulating debate. Firstly, I'd like to draw attention to the progress made on the East Coast Main Line, where today 3 privately owned open access intercity operators compete with the government-run LNER. This successful and mature model is now 25 years old and sees open access operators connect towns and cities across the north, which were traditionally not served or endured poor intercity connections. Open access is a great success, and the statistics reflect this on many fronts, which I'll come on to in detail. However, one group of towns they have not as yet reached are Grimsby and Cleethorpes and the intermediate stations en route. I am determined that the Brigg-Immingham constituency and the wider northern Lincolnshire area enjoy more direct and fast trains with London and other key cities. I've been campaigning for this service since 2011 and remain committed to delivering this key and long overdue connection. Mrs Lewis, if members will indulge me to focus on this constituency matter for a few minutes before I move on to the wider arguments in favour of open access. From a Grimsby point of view, it matters not whether the service leaves the main line at Newark and runs via Lincoln, or at Doncaster and takes the route through Scunthorpe. Either route will also serve Grimsby, Cleethorpes, Barnetby and Heyborough. Heyborough, which is just 2 miles from the country's largest port of Immingham, and for that reason alone, surely deserves a direct service to the capital. Some years ago, Grand Central submitted an application to run services via Doncaster, which was turned down by the regulator. I've been raising this issue with successive ministers, as I said, for many years. I've been given no end of reasons why it can't happen. First, there was the issue of capacity on the main line. But if the existing services to Lincoln are extended to Cleethorpes, that's not an issue because they already have a path through from King's Cross to Newark. LNER ran a trial of their Azuma units through to Cleethorpes and found no serious issues other than at Market Raisin, which requires a new footbridge and some work on the platform. But I think my right honourable friend may have something to say that during the course of the debate. It now appears that the problems at Market Raisin are being put forward as to why services can't go ahead. All I would say on this is that if the reported cost of between £15 and £20 million for the work at Market Raisin are to be believed, then Network need to improve their procurement process and find new contractors. Quite simply, these figures are ridiculous, and it sounds more like a tactic to convince ministers not to go ahead. I trust that the Minister will address this particular point in his response. Certainly, happy to give way.
I congratulate the Honourable Member for securing this debate. I'm very pleased to support him in it, and he has been a long-standing campaigner on this particular issue. On the point of Market Raisin and the improvements to the platform, is he aware of other areas in the country that are getting modular extensions to platforms that are proving much cheaper than the indicated price that he mentioned in his speech earlier?
My Member of Parliament makes an excellent point, and indeed there are other examples up and down the country where modest improvements have been made at minimal cost. Minister, it needs the Secretary of State to realise the economic benefits to the area, and she will surely see that this is an easy win to deliver on the government's growth agenda. As promised, I will now move on to the wider debate. The establishment of Great British Railways represents the biggest change in the way we run the railways since privatisation 30 years ago. We must keep and improve what clearly works and don't weaken or undermine key roles such as the rail regulator, so that we can make GBR fit for purpose alongside open access and deliver the best services for passengers across the country.
My honourable friend, give way.
Happily give way.
My honourable friend is speaking very well about the usefulness and benefit of having a good rail system, but he'd be aware of the new timetable that's being proposed by the national rail operators. And for my own constituency, Berwick-upon-Tweed, although being in England, is the most important station. It's going to be losing services to London, and the journey time is going to be increased to allow greater capacity for links to Edinburgh and Newcastle. Does he agree with me that we need to ensure that small towns across the UK do not lose rail connectivity to the benefit of larger hubs?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and that is one of the key arguments, I think, in favour of introducing more open access operators who have widened the number of destinations served. If you drill into the latest passenger and financial figures, there is a key lesson for those designing and planning GBR. I think we can all agree that we need better trains serving more places with more reliability and competitive fares. But there is a huge caveat which hinges on ministers choosing to copy the East Coast operating model, which, as I mentioned earlier, has proven such a success, and there is evidence-based statistics to show this. The Chancellor and the new Transport Secretary must note this model if they want to avoid a future of soaring subsidies and flatlining passenger numbers. It should now be encouraged and rolled out across Britain's railway network, including, of course, Northern Lincolnshire. The Office of Rail and Road Statistics show that where intercity trains don't compete for passengers, they are expensive, require big subsidies, have struggled to get their finances and passengers back since COVID, and endure poor passenger satisfaction. Importantly, the East Coast Main Line, which has seen the fastest post-pandemic recovery on the network and enjoys the highest passenger satisfaction as LNER subsidy continues to fall, and it could soon be subsidy-free. The Minister, who is in his place, will know perfectly about the benefits of open access competition, as Grand Central connecting Wakefield with London in competition with LNER. These services provide valuable choice and competition for his constituents, who can choose between operators when they travel. It also helps deliver inward investment, growth and regeneration, as direct rail services are invaluable when customers look at locations outside of London.
Will the honourable member give way?
Yes.
I think, thank the honourable member for giving way, and I think we will all agree that better choice, more services, particularly direct services, is an objective that we all want to see. And unfortunately, in Keighley, we don't have any open access provisions at the moment. So would the member agree with me that if we were able to achieve a direct link between Skipton and London, or indeed Ilkley and London, with more opportunity through open access, it would be not only better for the commuter, but would also deliver better local economic growth within my constituency and actually lead to cheaper rail prices for commuters in my constituency?
My honourable friend makes an excellent point and highlights the fact of yet another group of provincial towns that would benefit both their local economy and obviously for leisure as well. Where did I get to? Right. I hope open access rail policy features among the Chancellor's new tests on how we deliver growth across the country. As a Yorkshire MP, the Minister will know of the clear benefits so far across the county, whether it be Hull, Bradford, York, Doncaster or Selby, where open access have established and grown large rail markets. The new evidence shows that rail competition doesn't just deliver growth on a significant scale, but also delivers a critical competitive discipline where all passengers enjoy choice and more routes. In 2016, the Competition and Markets Authority produced a 200-page report on passenger train competition and reached that very conclusion. I wouldn't normally urge the government to look to Europe for good practice, but open access in Italy and Austria are two countries where the benefits can be clearly seen. Replicating the East Coast model can help prevent any risk of GBR sliding into financial and sector decline, which should be a huge concern for the Treasury. Crucially, open access is also a key component for British train building. Just before Christmas, the Prime Minister welcomed a significant £500 million investment in new train build at Hitachi's Newton Aycliffe plant. But it's important to consider that this private sector order was for new trains to serve existing and new open access routes. An option on a follow-up order of a further £500 million is, I understand, dependent on more open access routes being awarded by the regulator. Yes, I'll give way.
He's been very generous with his time, and I'm pleased that he's mentioned the Italian rail system. Obviously, Italy is very similar to Grimsby, but certainly would benefit from the kind of rail system that does operate in Italy, which is very smooth and very good value for customers. They have good stock in Italy as well, and when it comes to open access operators, if we are to achieve a direct rail service from Cleethorpes to King's Cross, which he's been campaigning for many years, the open access operators do need quick decision making in order to place their stock orders with manufacturers to make sure that they can get these services up and running for passengers quickly. Do you think that the Minister should be looking very closely at these things and making decisions as quickly as he possibly can?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention, and I agree with her. The comparison between Italy and Grimsby is they are very similar. But I will come on to the very point that she makes about the speed of decision-making by the regulator is absolutely crucial. As well as my own desire and ambition to see direct services serving my constituency, it is consequently important that the importance and significance of open access is fully acknowledged and nothing is done to weaken or undermine it. Why wouldn't the government want more unsubsidised direct fast rail connections across the country? Why wouldn't they want to secure hundreds of millions investment in forward orders for new trains to be built in Britain? Why wouldn't the government want GBR to face robust and innovative competition on key routes, which will inevitably see standards rise and fares and subsidies decline? Passengers at York, Hull, Wakefield, Bradford, Doncaster, Sunderland, Newcastle and Edinburgh all now enjoy up to 3 competing high-speed train services to London, where open access services compete with the government LNER. A plan to introduce a new fast open access service to connect Sheffield and Worksop with King's Cross is awaiting the green light, as is one to connect Rochdale with London Euston and one to connect Cardiff with Edinburgh. Hopefully, these will be swiftly approved so that passengers can enjoy more direct fast trains and real fair competition. These will all help these cities' respective leaders better make their case for inward investment. For example, Sheffield has not enjoyed a direct service to King's Cross since 1968, and the new service would rival the existing East Midlands service between the city and London St Pancras. In debates at transport questions, we frequently hear tales of woe about Avanti and the services it offers travellers on the West Coast Main Line. This could change. Just take the East Coast Main Line as a model. I urge ministers to get on with it. New economic analysis from Arup shows what can be achieved. The open access Hull train services, which connect Beverley, Hull, Selby and Doncaster with London, has delivered between 185 and 380 million in extra local benefits since the service was approved by the Tony Blair's government in 2000. These figures are expected to grow between 325 and 700 million by 2032. Prior to Hull Trains operations, there was just one direct daily train in each direction between London and Hull. Similarly, the Blair government also oversaw the approval of new fast Grand Central services to the North East and Yorkshire, and in the mid and late 2000s. On average, Hull Trains fares are 30% cheaper than the traditional services. As I said when I met with Hull Trains a couple of weeks ago, what they've done for the North Bank of the Humber, they could do for the South Bank. These direct rail links have boosted inward investment and done more for levelling up and regeneration than a host of Whitehall schemes. There are also significant environmental benefits, as it means more people abandon the car and coach and instead use the well-priced high-speed trains. The popular fast Lumo open access service between London, Newcastle and Edinburgh continues to eat into the aviation market and delivers crucial modal shift from air to rail. I welcome that there are many colleagues who wish to speak, and I would also like to cover the point that we've recently seen the Office of Rail and Road approve new long-distance open access services on the West Coast Main Line up to Stirling and between London, Paddington and South Wales on the Great Western Line. There is also approval for the new GO-OP application to run new open access services between Weston-super-Mare, Taunton and Swindon. We need to speed up track access applications. It can take up to 5 years for operators, as the Honourable Lady from Grimsby pointed out. We've got to speed this up. This is another example where the government could boost their growth agenda. The last thing that is needed is more barriers to open access. Speed up the process and get Britain moving. A recent survey conducted by Virgin showed that around 2/3 of all passengers welcomed competition between train operators on price and quality. This is all very encouraging and shows how an independent regulator can deliver good decisions in the national interest. A key question for the Minister will be, is more access to be encouraged and approved, and will an independent regulator return powers over this critical area after GBR is established? If decisions on open access are subsumed into GBR and taken off the regulator, then many of us will be concerned that the hand of civil servants and other rail planners who have been proven wrong in the past will, in their opposition to open access, will stifle and weaken this valuable part of the railway sector. If GBR is to be a genuine arm's-length body from Whitehall, which is pledged by ministers, then the future of the regulator and open access will be a key test. I look forward to ministers working with me and colleagues across the House to encourage and deliver new open access intercity services to northern Lincolnshire and destinations across the country. Thank you, Mrs. Lewis.
The question is that this House has considered open access operators for rail services. Call Alison Hume.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I would like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Brigg and Immingham for securing this important debate on open access operators. Rail transport in the north has suffered long-term neglect, with new plans to gather dust. From George Osborne's Northern Powerhouse speech in 2014 onwards, they've essentially been an unfunded wish list passed from one government to the other. But under our new government, we have Great British Railways on the table, and I look forward to hearing from the Minister about how we will be incorporating open access operators into our plans, because Madam Chair, the north-south divide is real. Total Treasury spending on rail in Yorkshire and the Humber last year was £1.25 billion compared to £9.3 billion for London and £3.1 billion for the South East. The current funding structure for transforming regional transport also makes it very difficult for areas such as the one that I represent in Scarborough and Whitby, incorporated into the York and North Yorkshire Combined Authority, to address the desperate lack of connectivity that exists. The main funding scheme that the government inherited is the City Region Sustainable Transport Funding Settlement, but combined authorities like ours don't qualify as they're not a city region. And that funding gap has left York and North Yorkshire struggling to even plan a transport strategy. So I'm hopeful that the government will address that in the spending review, and I believe that open access operators could step in and help. Coastal communities like Scarborough have suffered for too long from poor rail services, and it's had a major impact on our economies. I have been campaigning for a half-hourly service between Scarborough and York, which would be taken for granted in other areas, but seems an impossibility. The line was opened in July 1845. Madam Chair, it took just 1 year and 3 days to complete the 45-mile route, but TransPennine Express, which now runs services on the line, today appears to have little of that urgency about it. Scarborough is, of course, our first coastal seaside resort and is beautiful, and we also have the North Yorkshire Moors National Park on our doorstep, and the growth of staycations and holidays mean there's real potential for visitors, as well, of course, as the residents who are crying out for a better service. And with the creation of Great British Railways, we have the chance to have one body responsible for the strategic direction of our railways and ensuring, as the Honourable Member has said, that infrastructure and services work together and that we really drive regional growth. And I really urge the government to look at open access operators, because although they currently account for only 0.6% of total passenger journeys, they've got massive potential to open up new routes, such as the Scarborough to London via York route. If we look at the success of Hull trains, in 1999 there was only one train a day between Hull and London, and now there's 7 each weekday and 6 at weekends. And as the Honourable Member said, new direct services are being approved and opened all the time. Now, I do appreciate that there is an issue of whether open access services put extra pressure on network capacity, and I look forward to the Minister's response. But I do believe that unless we really look at how we serve coastal communities such as mine, given the poor connections, we will not move forward. And if there are any operators listening, I would really love to see a direct service between Scarborough and London. And perhaps we need a little, Madam Chair, of the... Yes, of course I'll give way.
I'm very, very grateful to her for giving way, and she's making a really important point about coastal communities. Rural communities find themselves in a similar situation where they've maybe lost a direct service. Wrexham, Shropshire and Midlands Railway have an excellent plan to run a direct-to-London service through those places that I've just described, Wrexham, Shropshire and the Midlands, but it's taking an inordinately long amount of time to get to the Office of Road and Rail. Would she agree with me that we don't just need keen operators, we need to be able to process their applications very quickly to give the people the service they deserve? Thank you.
I thank the Honourable Member for that intervention. She makes a very important point about time, and time is of the essence as we strive to deliver better rail services. And just to finish, I think perhaps we need a little of the spirit of the 19th century rail pioneers to fully connect coastal communities at last. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
Sir Edward Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I thank my honourable friend and my constituency neighbour for introducing this important debate and emphasising the national importance of open access. And what he says about Hull trains and the opportunity it's given us, is a very powerful point. I want to really just speak about our own little local problem, which he alluded to and the member for Grimsby alluded to. Originally, there were 2 trains every day going up and down from London via Lincoln and Market Rasen, ending up in Grimsby. Then that was cut down to 1 train. We were given a solemn promise it would never be taken away. Decades ago, it was taken away. I've been campaigning for decades to get this service up and running again. I mean, we're talking about a catchment area of 250,000 people with no direct train to London. I mean, I can't think of any other country in Europe where you would have such a situation. Huge conurbations like Grimsby and Cleethorpes, and the train running down to a place like Market Rasen, which I know is a small station, but it serves a vast rural area, going all the way to Louth, perhaps 20 miles in every direction. Yet every time we've been to see ministers, campaigns, over many years we get fobbed off with every single excuse. I can't count the number of times we went to see the Transport Minister in the last government. And now I'm boring this minister. And I'll go on boring him, and we'll go on making this point. I mean, as my honourable friend says, first of all, we were fobbed off with the point of view that there was no capacity on the main line. But the Azuma train runs perfectly well to Lincoln, and it would make no difference in terms of capacity on the main line if it carried on to Grimsby via Market Rasen. So that point doesn't happen. All right, we made some progress eventually, and I thought we'd finally got a commitment that this train would happen. Indeed, we had a test run in June 2023, and I was there, I saw it. Everything worked perfectly smoothly. The train arrived from Grimsby. There was no problem. We had our photograph taken. Everybody's very happy. But still, we've had no progress. And now we've had this sort of bolt from the blue, no longer this capacity point, that apparently we can't have this train because the platform in Market Rasen is too short and there's no bridge. But this is an absurd point. I mean, the fact is that trains, I go all over the country and I see trains stop at short platforms and they announce that, please, will you please go to the first 4 carriages because it's a short platform. And then we got the excuse that somehow if the Azuma train stopped at Market Rasen, it would be covering the pedestrian crossing, and this apparently is unacceptable. Well, is somebody going to try and go across the railway line and climb underneath the train to get to it stopped at the platform is ridiculous. I'm not sure it's even possible to climb underneath a train. Are they going to sprint down the track, leave the platform altogether to get round the back of the train? This is all just ludicrous. There's absolutely no reason why you couldn't have this train stopping there, blocking the existing pedestrian access. People, perhaps in 100 years there might be some sort of injury. I doubt if there would ever be any injury. But why are we stopping the whole service? Because apparently it's blocking it. And then it's funny, they never give an explanation. They say, oh, we've now got a problem with the disabled access and it's got to be in a certain part of the train. But surely there are solutions. This is a sort of not can-do attitude which is driving the country crazy. Whenever we write to these sort of bodies like Network Rail, instead of having the attitude, let's work together, let's make this work, we get, again, fobbed off with ridiculous excuses and they never actually explain their actions. Then they say, we've got to build a bridge. All right, they build a bridge. And then they have come up with a ridiculous figure of £24 million. How could it cost £24 million to build a bridge? This is only a small country station with just one footbridge. I think my honourable friend campaigned for years for a bridge, didn't he? And he got it for far less, £1 million, wasn't it?
If my right honourable friend will give way, he will remember from the last Parliament, I campaigned for a footbridge over Suggett's Lane in Cleethorpes and was supported, thankfully, by the Prime Minister, who on one famous occasion at PMQ said Suggett's Lane is never far from his thoughts. And I hope that the market raisin situation will be not far from the Minister's thoughts.
Well, I'm very grateful for that because, I mean, this is a serious issue. As I say, there's absolutely no reason why this great conurbation of Grimsby and Cleethorpes should not have a direct train to London. And there's no reason why the good people who live in the rural areas around Market Raisin shouldn't have a direct train. And it's actually, what's actually happened, this is not really the fault of LNER, you might argue, that since we've had the Azuma train going direct from London to Lincoln, our indirect service has got worse. There are more delays, there is less service. It really is hard work to get from that part of my constituency to London. So enough of excuses. We had a tremendous relationship with the Transport Minister in the last government, and we look forward to our relationship with this Minister in this government. There's nothing party political about this. What we are doing, the Honourable Lady for Grimsby and my honourable friend here and myself, we are begging the Minister to please intervene to knock some heads together to get this train going and stopping. And that is all we ask. Thank you very much.
Mary Glindon.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it is an honour to speak in this debate under your chairmanship. And I congratulate the Honourable Member for Brigg and Immingham on securing this backbench business debate, and thank the backbench business committee colleagues of ours for granting it. And he has made such a good case, along with other colleagues, for increasing open access services to his constituency and beyond. Madam Chair, in my contribution, I'll be celebrating the successes of an open access agreement that benefits my constituents in Newcastle upon Tyne, East and Wallsend, so I'm showing off a bit. I make no excuse. However, first I would like to reaffirm my support for the government's legislative action since taking office on public ownership. I supported the overhaul of our broken rail system in the voting lobbies, and I still support it today. Open access was left out of the scope of the Act. It is worth noting that in the year from 2022 to 2023, domestic open access passenger services accounted for only 0.6% of passenger journeys and 2.4% of passenger operator revenues. Ministers throughout the legislative process advised that they saw a continuing role for these arrangements where they add value and capacity to the network. And during a statement on railway performance in November, the previous Secretary of State cited First Group's Lomo as a successful example. The Lomo service runs between Edinburgh and London via Newcastle. Members will of course recognise that most trains that run to and from King's Cross on the East Coast Main Line are operated by LNER. But Arab estimates that at least £480 million of economic benefits have been realised since the first group's LOMO launched in 2021. LOMO has built capacity as a complementary service on such a core route in the UK. Running 5 services a day, it had given my constituents additional choice, increasing the numbers of trains to the capital. And for instance, it's added a new option for travellers between Newcastle and London to leave before 6 a.m. and arrive in London at about 8:30 a.m. in the morning. Open access arrangements, if done properly, should drive up the number of journeys on our rail and not abstract value from existing services. According to First Group, LOMO has helped to generate 6.2 million additional journeys, with 3.9 million of those taking place on LOMO services. Overall usage of the East Coast Main Line rose 18% in the 12 months to September last year when compared to the year 2018 to 2019. And this did include 11% growth in the usage of LNER services. Of course, modal shift will play a critical role in our journey to net zero. Decarbonising the grid, which this Labour government has taken firm action on, is a sizable part of this journey. Encouraging behavioural change in the transport sector will be some of the other hard yards that we must do. I support the Secretary of State's ambition to ensure the benefits provided by open access operators outweigh the impact they have on taxpayers and the ability to operate the network efficiently. And today, I've sought to advocate here what, in my view, a successful example of open access that has benefited my constituents and the broader region can do. And regarding the broader region, I would like to thank First Group for the investment of £500 million into new British-built trains by Hitachi at Newton Aycliffe, and congratulate my colleague, the member for Newton Aycliffe and Spennymoor, for his part in securing this successful investment. And I hope that First Group can gain approval from the regulator to serve more destinations, as this would lead to a £460 million follow-on order for new trains. Madam Deputy Chair, the most efficient use of our East Coast Main Line is something which is deeply important for me and all other North East members of Parliament. Growth and productivity in the North East of England have been held back by our infrastructure. So, in finishing, I would like to seize the opportunity to lobby the Minister for the reopening of the Leamside line, which would be a game-changer for the North East, freeing up capacity for more LNER and LOMO trains to operate on our busy East Coast Main Line.
Paul Kohler.
Thank you, Mrs Llewellyn-Bark. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. Can I first thank the honourable member for Brigg and Immingham for securing this debate and the Backbench Business Committee for granting it. We've heard lively contributions from across the House, and underlying all of them is a simple truth. In the UK, open access rail operators have a clear track record of improving services, increasing access and driving economic growth. However, the recent letter from the Secretary of State to the ORR makes it very clear the future of open access services in this country is at risk. Although the government's position is just one of the issues the ORR has a statutory duty to consider, the fact the government is asking the ORR to take a more cautious approach is clearly a concern, and I would be grateful to hearing the Minister's views on this and any assurances that can be given. Whilst the Secretary of State might have legitimate concerns regarding capacity and abstraction, I fear there's an ideological element to her intervention. The government is in danger of being led by doctrine rather than the facts. So again, an assurance on this would be gratefully received. As we heard from the member from Brigg and Immingham, the record of 3 open access operators, LUMO, Grand Central and Hull trains, competing against the government-owned franchise LNER on the East Coast Main Line has shown how competition for passengers drives down fares and drives up passenger numbers. Research has shown new open access operators competing on the same routes as incumbents typically offer fare reductions of 20 to 60% in the long term. At a time when fares are sky high, competition helping to drive down costs for passengers should be encouraged, particularly when it is compensated for by a commensurate increase in passenger numbers to more than cover the revenue lost per customer. Passenger numbers on the East Coast Main Line bounced back after COVID faster than in any other area, due in no small part to the competition on that particular part of the network. Not only is this good for passengers, it's good for the planet too. Cheaper tickets and better access to services, since Lumo has been running services from London to Edinburgh, has meant rail's market share compared to rail travel grew from 35% in 2019 to 57% in 2022. This is not just a UK phenomenon. And unlike the Honourable Member for Brigham and Immingham, I am delighted to look to Europe for inspiration. In Italy, competition between the open access operator Italio and the Italian state operator has driven a 90% increase in passenger numbers between Rome and Milan. Whilst in Spain, competition between Ouigo and Iro on the Madrid to Valencia route has resulted in fares 50% lower than on routes with no competition. Therefore, it is somewhat ironic that while Europe is liberalising its railways and seeing positive results, we are potentially moving in the opposite direction. Open access rail can also play a vital part in increasing services to many of our other underserved communities. As we have heard from the member for Great Grimsby and Cleethorpes and Brigham and Immingham with regard to Cleethorpes, the member of Keighley and Ilkley with regard to Skipton, the member from Scarborough and Whitby with regard to Scarborough, there are many towns and regions in this country to which open access can make a real contribution to improving connectivity across the country. With an eye to revenue, private companies have found gaps in the timetable and delivered for residents where the government has not. As we've seen today, any changes to open access arrangements by the government is likely to provoke ire from their backbench colleagues in Hull and Sunderland and elsewhere. The member from Newcastle and Wallsend, the member from Great Grimsby, the member from Scarborough and Ilkley, Scarborough and Whitby. These are, of course, backbenchers who know the value of open access and I'm sure will keep the minister's mind concentrating on how important it is. The same would be true of MPs representing areas where open access is still in its infancy or gestation. In Somerset and Wiltshire, concerned residents are taking the lack of rail provision into their own hands with the formation of Go-Op, the first ever cooperatively owned railway operator who plans to increase vital regional services in an often neglected area. Whilst in North Wales, the proposed Wrexham, Shropshire Midlands Railway will bring back direct services from London to Wrexham, helping bring passengers and further growth to a town already on the up. Although, as my honourable friend, the member for North Shropshire noted, it is taking far too long to get through the bureaucracy and get the service approved. And whilst we will hear from the Minister about concerns around capacity on the network, there are definitely areas which have capacity for a greater number of services. Take the Channel Tunnel, for example. The French owners of the tunnel themselves, Getlink, have said it was designed to double the capacity. And an application for a new open access operator on the line to compete with Eurostar are with the regulator. Introducing welcome competition on the line will help grow international train services to and from the UK and reduce ticket prices. It is clear, therefore, that open access should have a part to play in the future of the rail network. Whilst my party and I are agnostic regarding rail nationalisation, the Liberal Democrats firmly believe the private sector should play a part where there are clear benefits for passengers. We should be led by evidence, which shows that open access operators have made a positive addition to the network and the regulator has been successful in addressing concerns about abstraction. The government in its upcoming rail reform bill must therefore ensure that a fully functioning, properly resourced regulator is maintained. As we move to a model where 75% of rail activity is under public ownership, we must ensure this near monopoly does not crowd out others, such as freight and open access. Maintaining a competitive element of the railway is not only good for passengers, but will help the government guarantee GBR is delivering the best outcomes and, of course, grow the economy. Thank you.
Person Gregory Stafford.
Thank you very much, Mrs Liddell-Buck, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. It's an especial pleasure because this is my first speech from the front bench. I'm told you never forget your first time, but I do hope the Minister is gentle on me. I also want to thank my honourable friend, the Member of Parliament for Brigg and Immingham, for securing it. He has been a strong advocate for open access rail services, and I welcome his contributions today. He rightly highlights the importance of these services to regions across the country. I'm told in 2013 he was among a group of MPs who wrote to the Office of Rail and Road in support of expanding long-distance open access services. And while more progress, I think we would all agree, would have been more welcome, it remains vital that members like him and across the House ensure regulators are doing everything they can to encourage competition. This year marks the 25th anniversary of open access intercity train competition on the East Coast Main Line, connecting London, the North East and Scotland. And, Madam Chair, the benefits are clear. Lower fares, more choices, more routes, increased innovation and higher passenger satisfaction. This proven model should be used as a blueprint in shaping Great British Railways and the upcoming Railways Bill. And it remains frustrating that, despite its success, this model hasn't been replicated on other intercity main lines. As a Conservative, I value competition. When opportunities arise to introduce it into our transportation systems, we should take them. The evidence is clear. Open access services create new travel opportunities, especially for underserved or more rural communities, like my own constituency of Farnham and Borden. These services support economic growth and encourage a shift to greener transport. And that's why it's encouraging that new services were approved in 2024, including 2 entirely new routes on the West Coast Main Line and the Great Western Main Line, along with 8 approvals for smaller scale improvements. Recently, the Prime Minister and the Transport Secretary visited the Hitachi factory in Newton Aycliffe to celebrate First Group's £500 million order for 14 new Class 80X units, which will be a key part of their open access plans. These units will operate on Lumo's East Coast mainline services, as passionately described by the Honourable Member for Newcastle-upon-Tyne East, and the newly secured London Paddington-Carmarthen service, launching in December of 2027. Crucially, this expansion of services means more British train orders, boosting domestic industry, and I urge the Minister and his department to continue supporting further applications to sustain this investment. A regulatory framework that supports a sector investing in UK-built rolling stock and improving passenger services ultimately benefits both fare-paying passengers and the wider economy, as the Honourable Member for Keighley and Ilkley mentioned. The Government must ensure it facilitates services that serve the public interest. And like the Right Honourable Gentleman, my Right Honourable friend for Gainsborough, I'm also going to focus on a couple of local issues. He says he bores on. Well, I have to say, if anyone has the right to bore on, it is the Father of the House, and long may he continue to do so. Now, South Western Railway has been chosen as the first service to be nationalised this year, but the Government remains unclear about the impact that this will have on open access services. My constituents in Farnham and Borden rely on regular and reliable trains from Farnham, Liphook and Hazelmere stations to commute into London. As it stands, these services are frequently disrupted by strike action from the Labour Party's largest donors. And while the fate of South Western may be sealed, Madam Chair, the potential Guildford to Heathrow Terminal 5 connection, which would greatly benefit my constituents travelling to the airport, is under threat if open access services are restricted. Therefore, I hope the Minister can reassure my constituents that nationalisation will not stifle open access operators who play an important part in filling the gaps in the delivery of rail services. Meanwhile, as my honourable friend for Brigg and Immingham has said, the Minister's own constituency of Wakefield benefits from popular open access intercity services, which has led to lower fares, greater choice and better connectivity with London and the wider region. Furthermore, the open access operator at Wakefield has invested in station facilities. And yet, despite this, the Government's overall approach to rail has marched towards centralisation and nationalisation. And while the merits of this direction are a debate for another time, it's worth noting that the Government, both before and after the election, has recognised the value of open access services. The key question is whether this recognition will translate into tangible support for expansion. In September 2024, the former Transport Secretary, in a written statement to the House, was clear, and I quote, she said, "Open access operators have a proven track record in driving competition and better passenger outcomes. And where there is a case that open access operators can add value and capacity to the network, they will be able to." Does this position still hold with the new Secretary of State and his ministers? A clear reaffirmation would provide much-needed confidence to the businesses ready to invest. Open access operators not only add financial value, but also improve accessibility and convenience. In my own constituency, for example, there's a strong case for reopening the Borden line and station, or if not that, at least for a rail bus link from Borden to Liphook to enhance connectivity and increase train usage. We should remain open to innovative transport solutions that improve infrastructure, just as we do with open access. However, despite positive statements in the past, the Secretary of State's letter to the ORR in January raised concerns, signalling a shift in tone from the earlier commitments. Furthermore, some troubling rhetoric has emerged. Last year, a rail union leader described open access firms as parasitical during testimony to the Transport Select Committee. The RMT has also explicitly campaigned for Great British Railways to absorb open access operations and rail freight. Now, the Honourable Lady from Scarborough, in her speech, in her usual, I would say, BAFTA-nominated style, referred to the spirit of the 17th century. The danger with these unions is they'll take us back to the 1970s, and I'm sure none of us want to go there. Given the government's previous concessions to the rail unions, it's fair to question, I think, whether open access services could be curtailed in future negotiations. So can the Minister assure us that these services will not be sacrificed in such discussions? Another concern is that while the UK seems to be moving towards greater state control, as has been mentioned, Europe is heading in the opposite direction, embracing private sector involvement in rail. A European Commission report published in September of last year highlighted that open access competition led to a 31% reduction in ticket prices in Italy and a 41% increase in service frequency in Austria. The report's conclusions was clear, and I quote, "Open access competition across a variety of different cases both decreased ticket prices and improved the quality of the service as compared to the situation prior to the start of the competition." The government has now raised concerns about the impact of open access on overall rail revenue, and we heard mention of that today. However, the ORR has conducted thorough cost-benefit analyses, including cost consultations on the monetised impacts. If the new Secretary of State is questioning these findings, is it because they believe that the ORR has made errors in awarding the contracts, or is this part of a broader policy shift? The future and independence of the regulator is critical. Under plans for Great British Railways, will the ORR retain its authority over open access applications? Any move to transfer these decisions to Great British Railways or to the department would undermine transparency, accountability and independence, and we on this side would strongly oppose such change. The government's position, I'm afraid, remains unclear. Is it a genuine supporter of open access operators, or does it merely tolerate them as a costly inconvenience? We need clarity. With the ORR currently considering 13 applications, can the Minister confirm whether new guidance is forthcoming? More importantly, can he reassure the sector that any new guidance will not obstruct the growth of successful rail businesses that offer more choice and lower fares for passengers? The government faces a choice: embrace the benefits of competition and build on a proven success story, or retreat into centralisation at the expense of passengers. Madam Chair, I urge ministers to choose the former.
Minister Simon Lightwood.
Thank you very much. And might I say it's an absolute pleasure to see a fellow sand dancer in the chair today. A pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I congratulate the member for Brigg and Immingham on securing this debate on open access. This matter, I know, is of importance to many in this House and their constituents. And can I also welcome the member for Farnham and Barnham to his place on the front bench. I look forward to our sparring in future debates. Open access can open up new markets. We only need to look at Hull trains, where the private sector identified opportunities that the government had missed, to see how open access can benefit passengers and grow the market. However, it's also true that parts of our rail network are growing increasingly congested, and while open access operators can generate new income from the network, they can also abstract revenue from existing operators, including those funded by the taxpayer. We therefore need to ensure that there's a balance when we consider new open access applications. The Secretary of State was clear about this when she wrote to the Office of Rail and Road on the 6th of January. I know some members have raised concern over the Secretary of State's letter, so let me be clear. This letter did not signal that the door had been closed on open access. Indeed, the letter makes clear that there remains a role for open access. But new applications will have to demonstrate that their benefits are sufficient to justify any money they abstract from government-funded services, or the negative impact that they could have on publicly funded infrastructure projects, and they do not damage performance by increasing the complexity of the running of the network. I'm aware also that the Secretary of State's letter had caused some concern with freight operators, so let me again be clear that this letter only related to passenger open access. The benefits of open access to passengers on the East Coast Main Line have been highlighted by honourable members, and I've already called out Hull trains, but it would be remiss of me not to mention both Grand Central and Lumo, who also run on the East Coast Main Line. Both of these operators have increased choice for passengers. For example, Lumo now offers choice between short-haul flights and rail, with its fast services between London and Edinburgh. Now, open access services will increase choice and provide benefits for passengers on other parts of the network. Services have already been approved to operate from London to Stirling on the West Coast Main Line from later in 2025, and between London and Carmarthen from 2027. We're also aware of and considering a range of new applications that have been submitted by open access operators. These include proposals on the East Coast Main Line, but also more broadly across the country, including the West Coast Main Line. Whether these applications are successful is currently a matter for the Office of Rail and Road in its role as an independent regulator. The Department will provide views alongside a range of other stakeholders. The Office for Rail and Road will consider these alongside its statutory duties and will make decisions in due course. While it is true that both open access and operators contracted by the Department deliver services to passengers, there are key differences. Open access operators are not bound by public service obligations, whereas an operator delivering services for the Department will be required to serve all stations on a particular route. An open access operator can choose which stations it is to serve. For this reason, it's not possible to simply replace the Department's operators with open access. Were we to try and do so, we would risk depriving certain communities of any rail service at all. While constrained to a degree by the availability and capacity on the network, the lack of public service obligations means that open access operators can design their timetables to maximise commercial opportunities. This means open access operators can choose within wider operational constraints what time they wish to run their trains and at which stations they stop. This freedom means that it can be more challenging for Network Rail in setting the timetable. We've seen delays in agreeing the timetable in the East Coast Main Line precisely because there are so many competing demands, including open access operations. But it is not just timetabling that is more complex. When Network Rail wants to undertake engineering works, it needs to ensure the views of all operators are factored in. Obviously, when there are multiple operators with different operating models, for example, with a greater focus on weekend and leisure, rather than commuters, Network Rail will find it harder to keep everybody happy. This can reduce efficiency and increase journey costs, as Network Rail may have to close the network over a number of weekends and nights, rather than a single block, to ensure that all operators are treated fairly. I've talked about operational challenges that can be created. I want to be clear. We expect, as does the regulator, that Network Rail will make all efforts to manage the network in the most efficient manner, and in a way that will accommodate the optimum number of government-funded services. While open access operators can drive new revenue to government-funded services, they can also abstract revenues. The Office for Rail and Road recognises this through its not primarily abstractive test. While this test is not binary and is not the case that failing it means that open access operators will not get access to the network, it does highlight the potential impact on the taxpayer. We have a responsibility to the taxpayer to move the railways onto a financially sustainable footing. Therefore, if we see applications that are going to abstract a significant amount from the government's operators, we need to carefully consider whether, when providing the government's view, we support the application. Where there are wider socio-economic benefits that arise from open access applications, we will, when we provide our views to the Office of Rail and Road, balance these against the abstraction. But we have to be honest about the financial pressures the railways face and factor these into our considerations. I appreciate I've just talked at length about the challenges that open access can create as well as the benefits it can bring. I highlight the challenges, not to say that open access is bad. There can be real benefits. However, as government, we need to be mindful of the full implications of each new open access application. People have said the move to public ownership means that the government will be seeking to take open access off the network. I can categorically say that we have no intention to remove open access operators from the network. We were clear during the passage of the Public Ownership Act that it only applied to operators contracted by the government. I know there's been speculation that we would look to bring open access operators into public ownership when their existing rights expire. Again, I will reiterate here that that is not our intention. In terms of our future plans in relation to access to the network, we intend to bring forward a consultation on our proposed railways bill shortly. This will provide honourable members with the opportunity to review, consider and respond to our proposals. I cannot preempt the consultation and ask my honourable friends, members' understanding on this matter. Just to touch on some of the specifics raised by members today in terms of we've talked about the complexity of timetable challenges. Obviously, open access can and does make that a little bit more complex and challenging at times. And passenger growth on the East Coast Main Line, whilst open access operators have opened up markets on the East Coast Main Line, they are by no means the sole reason for passenger growth. The Department has invested heavily in infrastructure, leading to improvements in resilience and reliability, and has taken the lead on fare trials on LNER to simplify the passenger offer. Underpinning all of this is the fact that demand was already present on the East Coast Main Line, even before the intervention of either government or open access operators. In terms of charges, just to reiterate, open access operators pay variable access charges but do not fully cover the costs of fixed track access charges towards long-term maintenance of the network. Turning now to international comparisons, the member for Great Grimsby and Cleethorpes, while there are examples of open access competing with state-backed operators to offer choice to passengers in Europe, it really does need to be noted that there are many differences between the British network and the rail networks in other countries. That makes it really difficult to make direct comparisons. For example, some countries operate completely separate rail networks for inner-city and local services, creating a totally different environment for comparison than that here in Britain. In terms of additional services in Scarborough and Whitby, my old friend talked about the potential for open access to step in. Now, we're clear that where there are gaps and it can be accommodated, we will consider this positively. GBR will look at the entire network to make sure it is used as fully as possible. I thank the member for Newcastle upon Tyne, East and Wallsend. I'm sure the Rail Minister would have heard your message on the Leamside line, and if not, I will make sure I mention it to him. But thank you for your wider comments about your enthusiasm for public ownership and GBR. I think GBR will ensure that the highest level of customer standards and operational performance as a directing mind for our railways, and it will have a relentless focus on delivering for our passengers and, crucially, for freight as well. Some members have raised, quite rightly, the speed of which the ORR is making decisions. Now, we recognise it can take too long for decisions to be made by the ORR, and we're working with operators, including Open Access and Freight Network Rail, and the regulator to improve this. In terms of Cleethorpes and Skipton new services, I believe the Father of the House raised, was that? We are working with industry to understand the timetabling, financial, operational and infrastructure issues that need to be resolved. So I recognise the frustration, but we are actively considering what can be done. In my closing remarks, I just want to say open access plays an important role on the network. It will continue to play an important role in the network. We look forward to considering and providing our views on new applications and to our continued work with open access operators. However, we must and we will balance the benefits of new applications with the impacts that they have on both the taxpayer and the operational efficiency of the network, in line with the letter the Secretary of State sent to the regulator. I'm incredibly grateful to all honourable members for their contributions today. You have given us further food for thought and a useful insight into the benefits to your constituents of open access.
Martin Vickers to wind up.
Thank you, Mrs Lewell-Buck. First, I'd like to thank all those members who have taken part in what I think has been a very worthwhile debate, and to the Shadow Minister, who, at his first time on the front bench, I'm sure he'll go far. I would just emphasise, reference in particular, the demand for a direct service to Grimsby and Cleethorpes, that it does have widespread support in the business sector. The Hull and Humber Chamber of Commerce did a survey some time ago, and there is, overwhelming interest. The Minister mentioned the problems with abstraction from the main operator, and that was one of the reasons the Grand Central application was turned down 8, 9, 10 years ago. But I would point out, he talked about that, the impact on the taxpayer and the subsidy. LNER, of course, the subsidy is going down at the same time as there is more competition. So I would urge him to bear that in mind. As I say, I think it's an easy win for the government in terms of their economic growth strategy. And with that, I'll thank everyone for their presence here today, and I will rush off to King's Cross to catch the train, but unfortunately I'll have to change at Doncaster. The one advantage of changing at Doncaster, the station I know very well, is that the Honourable Lady and the member for Grimsby and Cleethorpes and I often exchange interesting gossip about life at Westminster. With that, Madam Chair, I'll conclude.
The question is that this House has considered open access operators for rail services. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting is now suspended until 3 p.m.